Mediopolis, Chapter 20, continued. The show. Young trialling childminder Lucy was with the elder animistry student's son in his room, and they were watching the projected images of the Season 7 of the Guru Woodland Challenge. And they'd been watching a group of last year's contestants and all the experts from the years before, including some of the elder gurus who were the previous winners from the earlier series. And they've been discussing how it was back in the day, in the early Guru series, in the shows they'd watched in the years before, in those that they'd even participate as well as watched in. One of the ex-Guru winners from years earlier had said on the show that it was different in his day. Yes, they had to prepare the straw houses and build wooden houses too, but they'd never done it for any tours. They just had to build it and construct it for themselves, to live together within it, to make it sustainable to live within and to live together. That alone had been enough of a challenge, without having to invite strangers or other people to come and accommodate the needs to. Those were more complex challenges, social challenges, on top of the already social and environmental challenges that the small group offered. They'd never had strangers touring through their woodland building, never before, so this was a new adaptation of the series. He told this to the viewers watching and the questioning presenters too, talking about some of his old-timer trials. Yet they had toured to look for animals still, to look for the food and spring water to collect, and also to source the textiles and fabrics that would be woven into the clothes and that would be made into the various bowls and ornaments. They had been out scavenging for the food, scavenging, foraging, and searching for it, to fabricate all the clothing and all the bed covers also that had to be made of the gathered in leaves. All of that had been tiring enough for them, to source it all, gather it all from the right places, and then to stack and store it, and then adapt it and use it as a raw material to make it into something. All of those, as well as getting on together during the challenge, had been more than enough of a challenge in all of the past series. So this new challenge in the new series would be something added to the extra challenges. Oh, and of course they'd had to march off to get all of the insulation too, both for the wooden cabins, but also for the firewood to keep themselves warm on the colder nights that set in. And maybe also to create clearings as well. They would clear large areas of scrubland, clearing back areas where they could pitch up small camps, or where they could even grow small amounts of their different vegetables. Sometimes for a day off too, they cleared areas where they could just relax in, places for them to just be at home within and just to rest within. Sometimes on the time off, one day of the week on the show, they would go off to explore the local habitat, the local area, to go off and see also potential foraging sites, but also just to be wandering around the woodland houses, to look and inspect on all the other competitors' houses in that woodland area. They weren't expected, though, to invite the others, the other woodland competitors, those other woodland groups camping out in the woodland shows. They weren't expected to invite them into the house. No, just to guard against them coming in fact. They certainly weren't expected to invite strangers, members of the audience, into the show and into their woodland show house, nor to go on tours around the actual homes or to the work sites where they did their foraging, their scavenging, their gathering, and also their collecting, and where they stocked and stored all the different materials of all the different barks and trunks of wood that had to be axed and sawed up. They'd never had to tour any visitors around those things, not in the past, but they would do in the future shows. Reluctantly, he'd agreed to go on, and he agreed, the commentator from the past, who was talking about his past experiences, and quite tired, talking with the pleasant, sympathetic presenter, smiling with him, encouraging him on, who'd said the format of the show just had to keep changing, though, because the forest too keeps changing, that all things did. The river keeps flowing, as the old saying, the slogan of the show kept saying. and that the woodland touring was just a part of the newer challenges that would be introduced to the current trialers. And of course, the old trialers wouldn't know how to advise them on those new trials. They would just be there to advise them on the current adapting versions of the older trials that still persisted too. So now the woodland touring would be introduced as part of the woodland survival and the woodland family and the woodland social grouping as part of their new test. The elder retired woodlander had said that he would continue still to watch the series even though he wouldn't understand the touring aspects of it. He would himself try to do a slow tour himself, going round to look at their progress of how they were constructing and adapting and maintaining their various woodland constructions, whether they were built in the high up tree houses or whether they were on the ground level, like the tree house, the tree homes, and some of the other thatched woodland houses, as well as the wooden cabin too. And then were also the burrows and the warrens. Two of the homes were actually built underground, one partially and one totally, in fact. Something that had only been done in the last series, but now they had explored out into vast terrains, whole networks and labyrinths of the warrens, with deep underground storage facilities too, so that they could have all manner of things to facilitate larger numbers of the tourers that could be accommodated in the under bunkers. There also could be a surplus of stock of food and different fabrics that could also be accommodated for the future series, if it was needed for potential future series. They'd sculpted out vast terrains of the underground in anticipation of hoping large numbers would tour through, and also in fear that they might need large storage areas as well, that were kept well hidden and stored in a place that could be protected by the group closely. There were all manner of different habitats and different kind of constructions, and the old timer, the old woodlander, had said that he wanted to go and assess all of them and see how the old ones had adapted, and some of the newer ones. The ones in the treehouse, for example, he'd not seen some of the high up woodland constructions, some of them built in the high up branches that had long ropes dangling from them, built out of twined branches strung together, plaited together and woven, with long dangling ropes and rope ladders. He would struggle to climb up, he said, but with some support. Older people had already done it, so he wasn't worried and would try and climb up to the treehouse when the weather permitted. And he'd said this to the rest of the group and the audience, assuredly, that he would try and get round and visit them all on his slow tour. The old tourer, the old woodlander from one of the earlier past seasons, from long, long ago, when the season had first spawned, from the second season, in fact, that he came from. He was sorry that he'd not been able to join them on this occasion. He'd been feeling a bit tired and unwell, and had toured last week when he'd given his advice on their activities, but he just didn't feel up to it with his current conditions as the week had worn on, but said he would like to try and join them next week. If he felt up to it, he would join them on another occasion. The other 4 past winners of the Woodlander teachers, they had all gone on to visit without him, leaving him behind in the small bushy house, last year's winner's Woodlandly home. The 5 competing woodland homes of this year's, the other past 4 guru teacher winners would go on to tour, visiting the 5 competing woodland homes, with one of the past winners of an earlier series, but from a different series, joining them also. And there was also a recording of one of the past winners who was not able to make it himself. He had passed on some time ago, and he had just left a message that was then later played. Sections of that message that were seen relevant to any particular part of the series could then be edited out of his speech and played at that time. He passed on some years ago, the original winner of the original Guru Woodland series show. He'd made that video recording while he was ill himself for any future competitors, and so that the show could use any of his advice, so that he could be included as one of the other past winners also, even though he was a past winner. The elder man had gone into the room of the young nature student, the animist student, with the young trialing childminder Lucy, to ask more about the animal studies, because he was getting more interested in that. And he was surprised to find Lucy was there with him. The pair were sat watching the scene of the nature show, watching a show of the couple, a couple that was sat inside the wooden cabin. They were sat there in a close-up scene, sat at the wooden table, with all the bowls that were made out of leaves themselves, and they were full of assorted leaves and various collections of seed pods, and also various other small collections of vegetables, of fruits, and lots of small branches too. There were dozens and dozens of bowls full of different kinds of leaves scattered all over the table, just long rows of them. The couple seemed so engrossed deep in conversation, they hardly seemed to notice the elderly man enter into the room and visit them quietly, entering into the room quietly. When he attempted to speak or ask them if they wanted to join them for tea, because he was going to have some tea, wanted to know if they would want to join him for a chat, before the evening supper would commence later. Trialing childminder Lucy had shushed him, though, saying that they were at a crucial moment, that they wanted to hear what was going on in the woodland contestants that were chatting to each other at a critical moment. And the rest had all left to go out on the woodland show, leaving the couple in the woodland cabin alone, at the wooden table, sat on their wooden perched stools that were constructed, basic but simple, to perch on. And the others had gone off, the other woodland contestants had gone off, marching off to the freshwater spring just up the creek in the woodland valley, going up to the spring to collect their barrels of water that they would carry back in their daily visits, that they so often laboriously still did, marching off together, sometimes returning, unison in song, on occasion. Whilst it was still light, they were out there going, catching up and storing reserves of water, stocking up. And they were supposed to be preparing also for the evening salad, the couple, for the rest of the group on their return. "I just can't believe that," said one of the young men to the other. "Up for eviction again," he'd said. "I thought I had a good week. I've been getting on better with everyone. I mean, oh, look at everything that's gone on. All the autumn gowns that I've sewed up for them. I mean, they wouldn't even be wearing them if it wasn't for me," complained the young man, sat slumped at the table, with his arms on the table, resting, sat slumped, a little down looking. "Well, you survived last week's eviction, and there are 4 of you up still," said the older man. They were both dressed in their woodland clothing, in their leafy foliage attire. It was an older middle-aged man sat with him. He'd been trying to sweep up with the wooden broom all the little branches, the broken off tiny bits. There were bits of mud and leaves all over the floor. He was brushing it with the broom towards the fireplace. And the younger man finally got up from his slumber, joining him in the work. "Would you vote for me? I mean, out of the 4 of us?" The younger man, up for nomination, up for eviction, having been nominated, he asked of the older man now, stopping with the broom and turning to him, joining him with the sweeping. The older man had paused, as if assessing all of the fallen debris around them. "Yes," he said finally, enthusiastically, after glancing at the youth, after a small hesitation, though. "You would say that," smiled the younger man. And the older man had looked more serious then, didn't return the smile, saying, "I would vote you in. I just find you easier to get on with than some of the others. I'm not saying everyone does, though," he explained as his rationale. "Do you think that's what the public will think, though?" "What about all the arguments, though?" asked the youth, brushing up some of the debris to one side, so much, and then following the older man, so much that some of the leaves fell onto the man's feet as he was stood near by the fireplace. "Well, they'll have seen both sides. They'll have seen all of the sides, probably. They'll make up their own minds, I guess, really. You're a good hard worker here. That's what's important to me and the team, I think. Well, then why did they vote me? I don't know. I didn't. They've got their own reasons, though. You know, you're a good worker, I think. When you do work, said the older man. I do. I work all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. I just missed one morning, claimed the younger man, now still with the broom, leaning on it and frowning, looking a little puzzled, almost wanting to laugh, but stopping himself, though. Unsure if this was a joke, the man said that. He thought they got on well, and that he admired his work so far. He'd not said anything about his concerns, although the others had said and accused him of being a slouch. And that other evening, of course, wasn't there? Reminded the older man. Excuse me, I was sorting through all the leaves. The clothes don't stitch themselves together. I've been on my own doing all that time. It takes a lot longer than people realise. Unless you want a naked group of ramblers around the place, said the young man, now a little upset, it seemed. And he was grinning. The older man was grinning at this, though, but tried not to show it. He was searching for the word as he trailed off. Well, you don't want a naked group of tribesmen, he finally said, reaching and finding the word. The old man then smiled a little, shaking off his shoes the debris, not sure whether to laugh at this, the whiny tone that he made, or speak seriously now. He chose the latter, saying that legs don't roll themselves. The logs don't roll themselves. No, they have to be carried in, and they don't axe themselves either. And the visitor's house wouldn't build itself either. And he said this quite seriously, going back then to the brooming and sweeping up the wooden floor as clean as he could. The younger apprentice, who'd been newer to the show, had said that he would be so much more involved in getting all the leafy costumes and the other fabrics for the visitors to wear, and also was assisting in making so many other soft furnishings. What did he think would happen? That naked visitors staying over, doing the touring, without even bed sheets? How on earth would that be possible, he claimed, asking the older man, who had laughed at this and said he thought the tourers would simply bring their own clothes, surely, and that they would bring their own bedding, and that there wouldn't need to be an authentic traditional seamstress that would be needed for any such things. The seamstress had said that they were trying to give an authentic woodland retreat. Surely that was the whole point of it, wasn't it? That's what he'd understood from it, at least. They were already making natural bowls and plates and all their own costumes out of things as much as they could so far, and that had got good ratings with some of the viewers anyway. And also, they would be making many things out of the leaves as well. And there would be wooden ornaments to furniture as well that would be needed to do. He would focus on those smaller jobs. His goal, he saw it, was to make as many things natural and authentic as possible. And why not the clothes too? And to be as authentically natural as much as they could be, more than all the other tribes would be. Surely that would have more of an appeal, especially considering many of the touring visitors would get to vote on how their experiences were, on whether it was a truly authentic woodland experience that might count much more and differentiate themselves more from many other of the woodland habitat groups. That was his theory anyway, that he has explained carefully to the older man, that they could be the most natural of all the woodland tribes. And after her long talk, her plea, that could have been for as much for the older man as for the public themselves, who knew any more. The older woodlander, listening, had finished the brooming up carefully and said it was all good to have limited natural textures and to have as many as you could. But a natural house was the most important thing to do first, surely, before any natural clothes or furnishings could be considered. Surely that came after, and that the natural house for the actual tourers and the public visitors and all the other visitors to the woodland show, surely creating the woodland house and the extensions was the most important thing to focus on first, explained the man. continuing on some arguments or discussions that the rest of the group had said earlier. And as the other water carriers could be heard now returning from their long journey, singing the usual group song, chanting it along together, as they did, and they neared the journey's end, where lovers meet and strangers retreat, and they wound their woven way through the woodland steep, and struggled hard along the muddy way. The loud chorus of their chant could be heard echoing off the rooftops of the large towering trees themselves. In desperation, they had marched along, weary from their journey's end and a long show day. To sweep away the rest of the fallen leafy debris, the older man suddenly pushed his broom hard along the floor, speeding up in a flurry of leaves everywhere. "Be careful," said the younger woodlander apprentice, worried that assortment of the bowls, the leaves that stood nearby on the edge of the table, could be overwhelmed by the flurry of leaves. And then taking the broom up, he swept up the rest of it alongside with the man, quickly, then catching anything that the older man had left behind him, brooming up behind him, and finishing the other side of the table. Now that the rest of the woodland group suddenly appeared at the door, with the brooming quickly finished, bursting in to find it all cleaned up, and the brooms hanging by the wall, and the men inspecting the bowls of leaves carefully on the table, making sure no stray leaves had blown onto it. And then in meandered the group, full of chatter and song and talk about the recent expeditions. The elder man having watched the whole scene together, with young Lucy, childminder, and also the elder animist student, he just watched a fragment, just a few minutes of the series he knew very little about, had heard a little of. Seeing the pair temporarily absorbed, he was about to leave them to it, when noticing his move, Lucy had asked if it was okay, if he didn't want something and didn't knock on the door and entered to ask for something. Why was he about to leave without speaking suddenly? Was there anything he wanted? Did he want help in anything, especially with the medication or something important? Lucy had asked the older man, and he'd said no, he wanted just to talk to the younger Kit, the animist student, just about the animal studies, about their earlier talks. Nothing that important for the here and now, though. And Kit had said, leaning over, that he could join them and watch now on the show if he wanted, and they would talk about the animism much later, if he could wait. He couldn't talk to him about it now. They were absorbed in following the show. As it was getting nearer the end, they could talk about the other issues soon, if it wasn't too important right now. The older man had agreed to return later and said it was nothing urgent, and thanked him for the invite to watch, but said he really hadn't been following the Leighton Woodland Guru series, and so he needed to watch back the beginning, or he really wouldn't know anything about it, or the characters' histories, to know about any of their plot lines or their current stories. And it wouldn't have made any sense to him watching it now. The eldest son had said he agreed it would be better to at least watch back the highlights, and said he could watch back the highlights of all the earlier episodes of the current season, so that he could catch up with where they were up to. Childminder Lucy had just dipped in and out of the trial show that she'd been interested in, but wasn't sure that it was something she wanted to commit to herself. She just visited the elder student's son occasionally to watch the show with him when she had a free 10 minutes, or 15 occasionally, just to watch what she could occasionally with him. And in her own spare time occasionally, she'd watch a little catching up in her own personal room too. The older man had never watched any of it so far, though. The elder student, the student animist, had said it was only episode 5 so far of season 7. So really, there were only the past 4 episodes of the current season that the older man needed to watch, and that he could see them all in one evening and a night, that it wouldn't take that long, as each episode was only a couple of hours, and then they could join him tomorrow, and the others if they wanted, for the 6th episode of season 7 of the Woodland Guru Challenges. The shows were only a couple of hours long, for each episode, so he could easily catch up for tomorrow if he did it for a whole night, or did it over a few nights, and then he could join him to watch the live stream show in a couple of days' time. Depending on how up to it he thought, suggested the older student. The older man had wearily agreed, before leaving the young man's room, with young trialing childminder Lucy, and young Kit had watched him leave before turning to say, "It will be 10 hours of watching though, including this one, I mean." And the older man had said, pointing to the projected image, still flashing away on the bedroom walls. "Well, 8 including this one," corrected the youth. "'Cause the first episode, it was really just an introduction to the woodland people, the woodland tree teachers and the others. And you don't really need to watch their backstories to know what they're about during it. But you can do. It adds more to it. But you can only just watch the 8 and you're still okay. Well, watch the other 2 and the introduction 2 hours another time," suggested the student animist, as the older man was backing out and slowly leaving the room. And then, feeling it was too much for him, closing the door and leaving with his considerations. "They're more like tree creatures right now," said Lucy, turning back to the flashing images on the bedroom wall being projected out still, and laughing at a few of the images of the people. Some of the people, the woodland people that were turning up back to the woodland house. They were plastered, covered in mud from head to toe. Evidently they had slipped down the muddy pathways, along that muddy path, and they had gone back, just carrying on, along the muddy path, falling over again and again. Covered in the mud, they were pushed out of the woodland house to wash it off later. Both of the men in the woodland cabin had watched. They had watched the muddy people appear, and a group of people dressed in leaves, in their leafy costumes, had all tried to push the muddy couple out of the woodland building. The couple that were covered in mud, were pushed out. The elder man, who was still stood, watching at the door with his considerations, shook his head in disbelief, wondering whatever will they watch next, wondering what kind of show it really was. Shouting to them that he was now making tea for himself, if they wanted one, but they both had shouted back, "No," and kept watching, turning back to the flashing images. "Don't worry about the children, I've seen to them all. Elder's looking after them," childminder trialer Lucy had shouted back to him, never turning her eyes from the flashing images, and the muddy couple being pushed out of the woodland carriage, and the various woodlanders that were dressed in their foliage and arguing with each other now, squabbling about the fallen mud and going outside of the woodland carriage, as they now pushed the muddy characters towards an area to wash them down, it seems. "Don't worry about them," shouted Lucy once more, as if the elder man had not been convinced by that, had looked somewhat confused by her appearance of abandoning them and of not being anywhere round them, after he'd overheard the mother advising her to go and look at the children to see how they were. He was a little worried, perhaps, though she'd felt they all seemed okay, with the older children with them when she'd last left them. Well, he left them to it. The mother supposedly knew best in hiring her, and she had been the last one to look into all their rooms, of course. And the older children were with them, who knew apparently how well they were. They had their many rooms along the winding corridors, ones that the elder man had never visited, so he never really knew what went on in those children's rooms. He was only ever passing by them, rambling through in his long winding passages that seemed to just go for longer. There were long winding corridors connecting long lounges and other rooms for resting, and there were more twisting, longer passages. The more you discovered in parts of the house, the longer you lived in them. Or was that just how it had seemed to him, the more he'd been there? Maybe he was just feeling more wearier, strained from the longer time and the energy zapped from all the different activities that he'd had to participate within, having stayed there a longer age now. He'd felt he had aged a lot in that short time. Or was it the house that was aging them all? He wasn't really sure. All of its residents maybe were changing themselves or changing him in their ways, changing his ideas in some ways, in different ways. Yet why did his stay feel in that way? If he didn't enjoy something about it, despite the crazy programs of some of the crazy people that there could be, some of them were interesting programs also, and fun, joyful programs at other times too. All sorts of different people and all sorts of different programs as well. Maybe it was only the craziness of some of the people and some of their programs that got to him some of the time. But some of the people had really enticed and excited him about many of the programs too. But then there were the programs that had repelled him as much as excited him as well, and those that had educated him, as well as dumbfounding him sometimes too, leading him into great confusion, not knowing what on earth the programs were, if indeed they even were that, or whether he would and did indeed desire them or not. He was left sometimes not being sure if he really wanted to watch the program or not. Did he desire to watch the program that he was interested in, yet didn't really understand that well? Then there was his own desiring of his own escape from his own craziness sometimes, only to return to his own crazy thoughts, his own crazy programs too. Other people's crazy programs could really be a good distraction sometimes from his own crazy obsessions, perhaps. Or perhaps they could give an insight to his own problems too, if they had some similarity. A different kind of craziness, quite different from his own. A different kind of obsession, much different from his own. But still, it was perhaps something that could still be somewhat relative to him somehow. It was perhaps his own familiar craziness that he needed a refuge within, from other people. And when that got too much, as it often did, there was always other people's craziness to escape to too, to provide a distraction, an insight sometimes, but also an escape from his own problems. That could also sometimes be overwhelming too. Perhaps we all did need each other, but sometimes perhaps we just needed ourselves too. After watching with the young student Kit, the animist student, and having a little laugh with him, and finding the show was a little informative, young trialling childminder Lucy had made her rounds of the other children's rooms once more, as she did regularly after the mother advised her to, where she often stopped to watch, listen, and also to hear, to absorb how a few of them were. Even occasionally, if time permitted, she would join in, talking along to the soundtrack, or reading the autocues with them, with a group of them, who were learning a foreign language perhaps, or through the listen and repeat language programs, where you had to echo the words that were spoken, and could also see how they were written on screen as you read them aloud with others from the projected autocue that was beamed on the screens. Just a few simple phrases and words that gradually grew more complex. Though the children seemed to laugh at Lucy's earlier, feebled attempts at the correct pronouncements, even when it was repeated often 3 times, having to listen again and again to the echo, and echoing back the characters' words within their own storylines. It grew frustrating, so much so that it was so repetitive to all the other children's. During Lucy's novel trials, her attempts to join in, because she was so unfamiliar with it to begin with the unfamiliar sounds and pronunciations, sounds that she struggled to get her tongue round and to pronounce clearly, and that provoked laughter amongst them, the first few attempts to begin with. But it became and grew more tiresome and frustrating after the 8th and 9th and dozen attempts, as she wearily struggled on to try and pronounce all the different sounds correctly. Then there were the other challenges too, the simpler challenges of just trying to pronounce and understand what the words were, as well as to pronounce them correctly. The challenges to say them at the right time, at the right rhythm, and to say them in a limited space of time as well. There were the time challenges as well as the pronunciation challenges to get round as well. She joined in a few of the children's challenges that they appeared to be participating within. Following much of the storyline that those challenges happened within was often quite complex and too much to do, because they often also got somewhat repetitive also. The point wasn't always to just follow the storylines though. Apparently there was one in some of them. Some of the shows at least had them, as well as the challenge within the storylines. So they were test stories, challenge stories too, apparently. That's what occupied some of the time. In one of the room, apparently there was one of them, where there was a boy, a character, projected onto the image of a story a group of children were watching. The image of the boy, the character had kept saying, "I love you," in the program, had repeated the words, accompanying this with a picture of his long-lost friend, as he was learning himself and had never said the words before. Each time he changed the emphasis of the wording, expressing 3 different ways of focusing it. I love you. And it focused on himself, the person. I love you. It focused on a loving act and on different types of loving, expressing that in different ways. And then I love you, that focused on different targets of the love, different people that the character boy projected in the images was the focus of the love too. The children watched back some of these images, learning the expressive words according to the different actions that it accompanied. As trialling childminder Lucy joined them, learn watching it with them. The children laughed at some of the expressions now and again and struggled with others, laughing at especially the new visitors in their feeble attempt to join in the show challenge games, who so easily mispronounced the foreign soundings, or saying them even at the right soundings, but at the wrong time, or to the wrong people often, until they had learnt properly how to do it more properly themselves, and knew what the objects of it all were. While they were staring at the picture of the long-lost loves of the character boy in this particular challenge show that childminder Trialer Lucy had started walking within, the young boy had then ripped up the picture in the show, saying the 3 emphatic words again. I hate you, he then said the 3 sentences. And this was then accompanied with the 3 different emphatic versions, the 3 different ways of pronouncing the sentence, accompanying it with 3 different versions, focusing on him, focusing on the action, and focusing then on the target, on the recipient of the actions too. But this was being a much more hurtful symbol, a much more hurtful action that was then portrayed. Childminder Trialer Lucy was though confused about this, wondering why on earth they would show, what kind of program would be showing and teaching things like this. Hurtful actions that were shown. Was it just to teach them what were those meanings, what the different words meant in terms of the different actions that they could lead to? Wondering what sort of language that they were teaching. Why were they teaching those different actions associated with the language to such young youths? The young trialer childminder had wondered. Then watching the young image of the boy crying over the torn up pictures, holding the broken pieces of them, scrambling through the broken pieces, the missing pictures of the pieces of his old loves, crying now, I mourn you, it went on, showing now the different associated images with mourning, according to the different pictures and the different emphasis of the sentences. Before it was then time for them all to echo back the sentences to the character himself, and only some of them did, and then Lucy did not, feeling uncertain that a language program was really needed in this way, and what its real purpose was, in fact, still not sure what the purpose of the show was, and concerned a little about what kind of program this really was, and she didn't unwittingly want to get involved with it before she knew much more. The character boy in the projected image that they were watching in the film on the side of the walls projected onto it with the usual projector, of course. They were watching it through little pierces in the window. The young boy was then saying, "I forget you," and then showing pictures of question marks or images that were disappearing or becoming vaguer that had been clearly pronounced before. His clearly known familiar world disappearing in different images. All the different little pieces then scattered he threw out of a window, fluttering down outside the house like confetti, that falling down like leaves from a tree. And then the film followed him, trying to collect all the different images of the picture together and to rearrange them in a jigsaw, to put them together, to redraw the picture then of the old pictures earlier. And then saying, "I miss you" in the 3 different ways, showing the visual accompaniment with it in the 3 different emphatic styles to show the different 3 meanings that could be emphasized with those 3 different types of actions. There were a whole variety of different accompanying visuals with that, with the usual echoers replying to it also, as if in some ritual following along. Lucy wasn't sure still if this was some sort of challenge or game or educational program that they were into. Where the new pictures that he now drew on a larger canvas, they were the paintings of all the different colours. What were guessed at, and they had to guess at who the different images were, trying to remember who the different people he loved were. The character had painted different portraits of different images, people that had appeared much earlier in the show, trying to match and guess how the different new pictures related to the older names that had been attached to the older pictures that were now being reassembled, part of a memory challenge also, as part of a naming and verbal challenge as well, apparently. The challenge seemed to involve the children having to remember the different people's names and also the actions that those names referred to, the visual actions that they represented, and to repeat them from just a few small sounds or just a few small images that were slowly gradually included more upon. So slowly more parts of their face appeared, or more sounds of their speech appeared, until they all had to guess which of the characters it was that was actually being referred to. Although there were so many names of the different professions and different people, different characters that had been in the earlier storylines that had to be guessed at. Some could be guessed so easily just by the costume that they were wearing, or the instruments that they happened to carry. A camera, a stethoscope, handcuffs, a rolling pin. Obviously the students all cried out, "A cameraman, the doctor, police officer, the chef," and all of the others would cry out too. And there were lots of other guesses. The artists who reappeared with his paintbrush was then there saying, "I forgive you," to the others, or they were saying, "I forgive you," to him himself, in echo to the others. And they were all saying it to each other. And the cameraman took a picture of the group together at the end to return them to the place where they had been to beginning, as it had been. And whatever the argument had been, she'd never known what it was anyway, and perhaps would soon be forgotten. As the show raced on, it went at great paces. It raced on to the 3 of them in a group, now having to rush off to some emergency, with the cameraman following along behind the police, and along with the doctor, rushing off to keep up with the audience, following along with the storyline from a distance, feeling that they all seemed content watching along, the children, watching the drama, what was really an educational challenge learning drama. Lucy left them to watch and talk and echo along, and she left them watching it happily, feeling that they seemed to be okay and learning what new words were to say at the right time and in different situations. Lucy had then left that room and had gone on to make them all drinks after taking their orders. She had a lot of rooms to get round still and a lot of orders of the different drinks for drinks time to get through. And the heavy drinks machine, of course, would have to be pushed around later as well. So she only stopped off briefly just to take the requests of some of the older children's rooms that she would have to be looking after. Then she visited some of the older rooms of the older children. And of course, there was older Kitolina. She would have to be visited, who was not called the kitchen receptionist or the kitchen worker or the kitchen maid or anything like that. No, just Kitolina, except by rude younger students who knew no better. She robustly had told Lucy at the door, apologising for any mispronunciations of the names earlier. Kittyana was a name that was given by a dear friend so long ago, when they'd given each other beautiful names. I was Kittyana to the alarmer. Kittyana the alarmer, had said the elder child. Lucy was amazed to see the sheer number of different clocks and alarms scattered all over the rooms. Small alarms, giant alarms, mechanical, digital alarms, analog alarms, colourful, playful alarms, picture alarms, visual alarms, book alarms even. There were even small object alarms that she never really recognised as that until she was told that by Kittyana, the alarmer herself. She was told what some of the alarms were, if not all of them, and especially was interested in some of the electronic devices, the electronic machine alarms, ones that were more familiar too, though she still didn't know about some of the other machine alarms, ones that she'd never had to use. Why was she called Kittyana the Alarmer? Wondered Lucy, who was amazed at the sheer number of clocks pinned all over the walls, occasionally that went off, that said what all of the different anniversaries and all the different times of the children were, that also told the times of many of the other elders, told the times of their anniversaries, of the arrivals when they'd come into the house. They told when people would enter the house, and also when their scheduled departures were, though those were never always that accurate. They also told 5 minutes before pre-programmed visits. There were also alarms pre-programmed an hour or 2 hours behind some of the visits too. And she had apparently gone on to tell them that there were so many different times because they had to be so punctual with the time. And she had to too, and could be watching 5 different clocks while she was in the kitchen sometimes at the ovens, and could somehow be watching a number of different watches. She had straps of them, all with different buzzing alarms, each with a different symbol or different sound, or that would make a different vibration, so that she would know what it was an alarm for. She could sometimes juggle at least a dozen different alarms, a dozen different sounds, or symbols, or sensations, each that she'd know well. Some that would go off after every few minutes, some that would only go off every few hours, and there were some that could even go off every few seconds even. And she would have second alarm, minute alarms, and even hour alarms strapped to her body, so she would feel when they went off. Or sometimes, if she couldn't have too many attachments, she would just hear the sound, if she was in her room, of course, where the visual and the auditory alarms were mostly placed. Some of the heavier ones just couldn't be carried around, not when she was mobile, having to travel to other rooms, she'd assured young trialling childminder Lucy, telling her about many of the different alarms that she needed for her alarming works. In her kitchen works sometimes she'd had half a dozen alarms for many of the complex recipes, when she was cooking a number of different ingredients all at once. And then she'd have her eye on several other things in different rooms going on, where she'd have to abandon the cooking at the right times, to go and check on some of the older children, or to look on some of the other visitors that she'd left upstairs, that she was escorting around some of the rooms, that could be left for a time without any need to look round some of the kitchen recipes that she was showing them, that would only need answers later to some of the more strange questions. She had so many multiple alarms, both for the profession she was doing and the room she worked within, but a few others for other rooms that were for other work that she would have to leave to do elsewhere as well. An astonishing array of alarms that she would have to carry on her person, sometimes, for some of the more complex, alarming work. It was her ability to be multitasking, multi-alarming, that she could efficiently coordinate all those alarms into multiple systems, to wear the alarms as well as being surrounded by them, That's what gave her the title, and that people knew her as Kittyana the Alarmer. That's why she was known as that, and just Kittyana for short now, by others, who knew her from the alarming well, so no need to constantly give her that name, since they already knew she was that, didn't need the reminder of that at all. After spending some time with the mother of the children that she helped out in their program, she helped out with the house alarms on some of the program alarms to tell them when to watch, when to stop, when to pause, and when to pause for different activities too. She had different programmed alarms for the different children to tell them when she needed to set up different programs that they would need to watch for the educational purposes. Then, as well as the program alarms for the children, there were also the house alarms that she had to frequent as well. When the doors had to be opened, visitors welcomed in, given a brief tour, shown to a particular room, told about a particular thing, given some videos, put on a program to watch, told what they had to wear, or when to expect the person, the mother who would be late, or the other aunts that were staying over and entertaining the visitors. She would have to give them some information. Usually it was brief and just short things that she would have to read off an autocue, relatively simple things to do, where there were the alarms telling them that she needed to go and collect them from the door, and what to do to introduce them, who they were, how to guide them if they needed support up the stairs, if they were able to talk, what language, and in what way to do so, those sort of things. There will be door alarms and the various room alarms as well, where to open the doors and when to close them. And also, of course, there were the children's alarms for the children's programs, those that couldn't work their own programs themselves, neither could they turn them on nor off. They needed someone to pre-program the devices to make sure they had the educational programs that was right for their own needs and abilities. So there were a lot of different alarms she worked with. She'd assured trialling childminder Lucy. The house alarms consisted of the door alarms themselves for those visitors, so that they could be welcomed in, shown to the right room for the right visitor and the right activity that they were visiting for. And then the specific children's alarms, the child alarm programs that she had to attend to sometimes. For the house alarms, so that visitors were announced, they were often announced to distant rooms of the house, but to her specifically. If a visit was getting overheated at some point, that rarely ever happened, she tried to reassure trialing childminder Lucy. But if it ever did get overheated into some kind of escalating argument, then an automatic alarm could be triggered off by one of the house guests, and that automatic alarm was sent to her or a number of other elder children or elder visitors. And that could trigger anyone that wanted to trigger off an urgent alarm, that could send out a warning alarm in the house. It could tell people also to evacuate the house if an incident or serious accident had also occurred, perhaps, and could also help in any particular room. It could not be pressed by accident, however, because there was no accidental alarm. It was very specific, yet very simple to work, a simple combination that had to be pressed. Yes, it could not be nudged on or lent on accidentally. You would have to know it specifically and type the buttons in purposefully. So it was rarely ever pressed. And if it was just normally a false alarm. Just a joke that had happened rarely in the older days. Then the false alarmers may not be believed in the future. They could still press the combination, sure, to trigger off the room alarms to those that happen to receive them. Or even a house alarm, perhaps. Or even a street alarm, if that didn't answer. Yet it could easily be turned off in any room. The room alarms could be turned off by others in the house themselves, or the street alarm could be turned off by others in the street also. There had been those that had pressed the alarms whilst they were younger, maybe experimenting or just mucking around, playing with friends. Their visiting friends maybe had suggested to do it, mucking around, in jest, just thinking it was fun, for a lark. Perhaps they were just drinking too much. And one room had tried it just as an experiment, though they'd also tried it multiple times, apparently just to reassure themselves that those alarms actually did work. There seemed to be some doubt, some belief that perhaps there was some fault within them, or some fault might materialize over time. There were some doubts in believing about the house alarm system, that it might not seem to work, and some felt the need to experiment and try it every now and again, just to see if it really did still work, if it really did still function properly. Despite being given all the assurances by the mother of the house, Daniela, and also Kitiana herself, and a number of the other elder children, and some of the elder visitors, especially the elder technicians, who'd assured the elder mother herself they'd all been working in good, reasonable, functional condition. On a number of conditions, on a number of occasions, people had not rushed out to the room that had persisted in such testing for false alarms, so that ironically, in testing the alarm system too much, so much it no longer had worked, not because there was anything wrong with the actual alarm system technically itself. It had been working fine, reasonably well. It wasn't overused or misused. If it wasn't overused or misused, then it did work fine. The majority of the time, knowing this, people no longer experimented or doubted or tried out the alarms doing the experimental trials, knowing that visiting experts would do that themselves and that it was not necessary for the visitors to constantly or often or even ever to try that themselves. And so they no longer often pressed those alarms for reassurance or for experiment or just even for a laugh or even simply out of curiosity. It was like swearing. The loud siren was so shriek, so piercing, so loud and shrilly vulgar that it grabbed attention to everyone anywhere in the house. If it was a house alarm, or if it was just a room alarm, grabbed the attention of everyone just in the room itself. And if you swore too often, of course, it would lose its shock value. A real shock was when someone swore that never normally would and was just totally out of the blue, out of character. When an alarm came from a room or an hour that never had a history of experimenting with alarms or joking alarms, or never even pushed the alarm and no history of it, when others probably would, then people knew it must be therefore serious. If the elders were normally quite calm and restrained, even if in highly testing times, if they only cried out if something was much more urgent, then it had a much more dramatic effect. It had a dramatic effect on all. Because of their crying out and shouting out at trivial things, some of the younger people were not always believed by the elders, therefore. The middle-aged children were much more cautious, therefore, as were the older, in their usage of such panic buttons. Yet still, they went into investigations, even into the children's alarms, just to be sure, if anything. Katiana had said all of this to the visitor trialing childminder Lucy. She had said some of the elders did worry that they might be underusing the alarms, that they worried that people, like the older visiting man himself, they might not want to worry other people. Yet she felt sure he would sound a house alarm if he had genuine fears for the safety of the house itself, but not necessarily a room alarm if he had safety for just him. If he had concerns for just him and his safety, then she doubted Kitiana that actually the older visiting man would press the alarm for his own room himself. But she wasn't sure if he and others were underusing their own room alarms out of fear or a desire of not wanting to take up other people's time or energy, or just not wanting to worry about others or worry other people too much. On entering her room, Kitiana had given a long talk to childminder Triley Lucy about the alarming systems, the house alarms, the room alarms, the door alarms, as well as also the kitchen alarms, those ones that she knew really well, of course. She knew little about the lounge alarms, resting alarms, or any of the other house alarms in the distant remote parts of the house. The parts of the house she didn't visit that often. And she knew little about the garden alarms outside of the house, nor the street alarms, claiming she could tell her little to nothing about those things.